So I wanted us to take a look and to see if anybody can tell me what this is up on the screen. Does anyone know what that is? Negatives. Yeah, negatives, photo negatives, right? And maybe some of you are thinking, she's too young to know what photo negatives are because she's in the digital age. Well, I'm here to tell you, I grew up on having to put film into cameras. I don't even know, 35 millimeter, but what's the film where it has the bulb on one side and then the 8 millimeter? Okay. Anyway, so that was my first camera was the flat ones. And I remember, like, sometimes I would take all these pictures, and I really wanted those developed, but you have to take all the pictures, right? So I would just be like, click, 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 so I could get those first earlier pictures. And then my mom would be like, what are these? I'm like, I don't know. I think maybe something happened or whatever, but look at this picture. My best friend and I, we used to, before selfies were a thing, I don't even know what we called it. We would always try to take pictures to see if we would get ourselves in there, like half off, half. So we were like ahead of the selfie game, I feel like. We have so many pictures. And we would do it in like, we would be like, what's the craziest place where we could try to see if we could get our picture? So we would do it on like roller coasters. Yeah, I don't know. And we never lost the camera, thank goodness, but I have no idea why. Anyway, photo negatives. So this is what you get when you are wanting to get an image, a picture of something. But photo negatives, they don't really give you that full image. In fact, it's a bit of a distorted image. You can't really see exactly what it is. There's parts of it that are light that should be dark, and parts that are dark that are light, and it's very unclear and a little bit hazy and gloomy, right? But these difficult to see negatives give us a beautiful, clear picture. And they're actually called, after you take the photos, and probably somebody who's more into photography can speak more into this, but you can take these, and they're called positive prints. So you take a photo negative, and you create a positive print out of it. So you have a distorted, difficult to see negative image, and then it transforms into a beautiful, clear, positive picture. The book of Ruth starts with, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine. A time marked with the judges, a time marked by everyone just doing whatever they saw fit. It was a dark, gloomy, distorted, unclear time. And there was a famine, and this family, their response to it was they ran away, which leads to tragedy and death, and it leaves a bittered, widowed woman, Naomi, with her 2 daughters-in-law. What can become of a family that endures these type of negative experiences? Where is the positive picture, the positive print in this? Maybe you've asked yourselves these questions before. Maybe somebody has asked you these questions. Well, that's what we've been trying to unpack over the last several weeks. And as we close out the book of Ruth, I want to have you think about this idea, how God might be at work in the very ordinary and mundane details of your life. How is God wanting to bring about positive pictures and image in the midst of ordinary and mundane details of your life? So let's dive into our final text in the book of Ruth, and then we're going to take a step back and look at it as a whole. So last week, we talked about Boaz becoming the kinsman redeemer. He acquired Naomi's land, and he acquired Ruth as his wife. And so we are going to pick up chapter 4, verse 13, if you would like to read along with me in a Bible. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. And the women living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron, the father of Ram. Ram, the father of Amminadab. Amminadab, the father of Nahshon. Nahshon, the father of Salmon. Salmon, the father of Boaz. Boaz, the father of Obed. Obed, the father of Jesse. And Jesse, the father of David. The word of the Lord from the book of Ruth. The end. Thanks be to God. So Ruth and Boaz are married. That's exciting. So Ruth is living with Boaz now, so she's no longer living with Naomi. And it says that the Lord enabled her to conceive a child. The Lord enabled her. She was childless before, and now the Lord had made it possible, had gifted her a child. So this child was from God. It was a gift from God, given by God. And then it says, I know I just read this, but at the bottom of your sermon notes, this is also there. And then it says, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age." The women here are praising God. They are aware of what God is doing and where God is at work, and they are bringing praises to God. Praise God for this guardian redeemer. They recognized where the blessings were coming from, and they noticed God in the midst of everything that was going on. So this guardian redeemer, he is the one to renew Naomi's life. It says that he will renew your life, which that literally translates as cause life to return. Cause life to return to this woman, Naomi, who returned back home. If you recall, she returned empty, and now this guardian redeemer is causing her life to return from an empty life to a full life she is experiencing. He will sustain Naomi in her old age. This woman who didn't have anyone to care for her as she gets older now has somebody who can literally translate it. It means to feed her gray hairs. He will care for her until she dies. This widowed, childless woman now has someone to care for her and to carry on her family line. Naomi, she thought that the tragedy and the deaths of her husbands and sons was God's anger against her, and God was punishing her, but we see that God wanted to restore her and wanted to reveal himself to her in the midst of her tragedy. God took a photo negative and made a positive picture and print out of it. And then in the passage, it continues on. We get to see Ruth's loyalty and devotion again, as we have seen before. And not only her loyalty and devotion, but the women even call this out in her by saying, "Your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons." Better to you than 7 sons. So 7 sons in Israel at that time for Israelites, that was the ideal number of sons. The 7th person in a family line, when you say the family line, the 7th person is the most important. 7 was an ideal number of sons. And one woman, Ruth, is better than the ideal 7. And that is why Ruth has a book in the Bible named after her. That's just my thought. It's just my thought. So just to be clear, Ruth gave birth to this boy, and then she has probably given over the legal rights of him and the everyday care of him to Naomi. Now, did she have to do this? Was she obligated to do this? No, she wasn't. She did this because she has a deep love and care and affection for Naomi. She did this because she wants to show Naomi her devotion, her loyalty to her, saying, I want you to experience God's goodness and be sustained all throughout your life. And this boy, this guardian redeemer, he's named Obed. And so Obed means one who works, one who serves. He is the servant of the Lord. And indeed, he does become a servant of the Lord as he serves Naomi until her end of her life. And then he serves all of Israel as he becomes the grandfather to David, who David becomes the greatest king in Israel for the Israelites. And then David's line continues on to become the family line of Jesus, the Messiah. And so this is where our story ends. It ends with a baby guardian redeemer, a servant of the Lord, bringing about restoration and redemption to a family, which carries on a family line that restores and redeems an entire nation of people, which the lineage continues on to bring about restoration and redemption through Jesus that each one of us can choose into today. Robert L. Hubbard, he's the author of the Book of Ruth commentary that we've been following along with. He wrote this. In Matthew, the book of Matthew in the New Testament, Matthew extends David's royal line and its foreign female members down to Jesus. This extension by Matthew means that without this Moabite girl, without Ruth, Christianity would be without its founder. Israel and the world would be immeasurably the poorer. It joined, meaning Christianity joined the book of Ruth already concerned about people outside Israel. Christianity joined with God's gracious dealings with the whole world. Our story began with a negative photo, a gloomy, dark time, tragic. And as our story unfolds, we see the impossible become possible. We see an active God at work continuously in various ways, in various places. We see ordinary people make extraordinary decisions. We see prayers answered, blessings fulfilled, tragedy and death becomes birth and life. Naomi, who returns home empty, is now made full through a son that can care for her. Ruth is repaid for what she's done, and she finds rest in the home of a husband, Boaz, where she will be well provided for. Elimelech, the patriarch of the family that kind of began this whole thing, and the irony of what his name means, my God is king, he indeed becomes father to King David, which then becomes the line and father to the Messiah, King Jesus. So God does still reign. And Obed does become famous throughout Israel. And God's hesed, God's extraordinary loyalty, gracious devotion, steadfast love is shown to the living and the dead, to all of Israel. And then it is shown to us today. This is where the story ends. With a positive print, a beautiful picture of God's big story of redemption for the whole world. The book of Ruth is a bigger picture for us. Now, God, he could have just done whatever he wanted in whatever way he wanted to make these things happen, to restore this family, to redeem them, to restore us. But he did it in a unique way. We saw God's influence and provision at work behind every seemingly mundane and even ordinary moment, and weaving together the circumstances and choices of each of the people, of Ruth and Naomi and Boaz, he used these faithful and loyal people. He worked through their clever, courageous, and ordinary lives. And when they chose to trust God and chose to follow God, they saw amazing things happen, and we get to see those amazing things happen. And so that leads me to the only point and the only fill-in on your sermon notes this morning at the bottom there, that the book of Ruth shows us and reminds us that God uses the faithfulness of ordinary people to do amazing things. God uses the faithfulness of ordinary people to do amazing things. I said earlier that the book of Ruth, it invites us to consider how God might be at work in the ordinary and mundane details of our lives. And so when you think about these people, when you think about Naomi, a widow, Ruth, a foreign Moabite, Boaz, a farmer, they're ordinary people. And they met in ordinary ways of just living their lives. In a dark and gloomy time, the way to survive this traumatic Judges period, in a dark and gloomy time, the way to survive a traumatic period in 2019, what year are we in? 2019, is through the faithfulness and loyalty of everyday, ordinary people living out God's hesed in ordinary and mundane ways. Their actions and response to God is what turned a story of tragedy and death into a story of joy and life. A photo negative was turned into a beautiful, restored picture of God's love for his people. And that can be something we can experience today. That even in our ordinary, mundane lives, we can see God restore and redeem us and other people. So we have a family in our community here that has a story that parallels this book in a way. And so I think it's a helpful and a hopeful way of seeing how the book of Ruth can be lived out today. And so we're going to watch Chris and Mindy's story for a minute.
Well, we're not really planning on another kid. We don't know, we have no idea.
If it was a boy or a girl, it didn't matter. I was excited to have another kid, but I did want a girl. We're filming the ultrasound because we did it with the other two, and Mindy was in there for a long time before they even let me and the boys in.
I remember that he said one thing. He said, I think we see something in her heart.
No, just she would come in and say, look, if it's my opinion that you should terminate the pregnancy. Hang on a second. Give us some options here. We don't have time because you have 4 days left, and what are you going to do? Well, what if we keep it? Where do we go? And then, well, if we need to know for sure what you're going to do, it's just.
I just asked her the last question, which is, I said, what's the chance for her to survive? And then she says 50. I didn't expect that. I just bawling, crying, and all. I just lost what to do. The way I just hope. Think too, the whole thing, I get in touch with you and get in touch with other friends, Lucy, and then I got back time in the church, and I did make the appointment. I don't want to run out my time. At least I know whatever I decide, I still have my appointment.
But that night that you told me that you had made the decision and you were going to go to your appointment.
Yeah, that night.
I came here crying my eyes out to the parking lot of the church. And Philip had caught me in the parking lot, and I was, a wreck. And Pastor Mike and Pastor Ryan happened to be here, and they took me in the back, and I was just, pouring it out and letting it go. And Pastor Mike told me that I had to go to the appointment with you the the night before we were going to go to the appointment.
And at midnight,
Yep.
I make that decision.
She woke me up and said, I'm not going to go. She was, 8 months pregnant, and we put her on a plane and moved her out to Florida. Babies with CDH, it's a lung issue, so he said she probably wouldn't cry, and when she was born, she let out a little peep.
No,
And
I mean nothing.
I heard a little mouse squeal. When she was born, the doctors were doing scans on her, and they found something called a duplication cyst, which is actually the body duplicated her stomach. Mm-hmm. So the duplication cyst is resting on her stomach and leaning up against her esophagus, right? And Dr. K said he had never seen anything like that before. He said, I'm not going to mess with it right now because it's not hurting her. So later on, when we're about to be discarded from the hospital, 99% of these kids have to have a G-tube, a feeding tube, because they can't keep the food down properly because of everything that had happened in utero. Our kid on life support and wires everywhere, and we're just told she's got another issue. So it turns out that this cyst is putting enough pressure on her stomach and her esophagus to where she does not need a feeding tube. Said that if we would have decided to go anywhere else but to him and his team, that Bella would not have survived. That's just the Lord working step by step by step. First termination. Now what do we do? And then the Joshua connection, and then Dr. K's, and then UCSF. And, well, why don't we just decide to keep Bella but stay closer to home? She wouldn't have made it. Yeah, you got to go to Florida.
I trust him with my bottom of my heart now. And I talk to him every day with my children. Every night we go to bed, we pray.
When you put your faith in him and you trust him and you put the risk to go and do what he's telling you to do, he's going to bless you. And he has 100 times over with us and Bella and everything. And it's amazing.
I cry. I've seen that video like 5 times. I cry every time. So Chris and Mindy, they unexpectedly learned they were pregnant. And then they got this tragic news that their baby had CDH, which is congenital diaphragmatic hernia. You can look it up, or you can ask them if you want to learn more about it. But basically, it limits the lung growth during pregnancy because there's a hole in the diaphragm, and so the things that should be on the bottom move up, and so it doesn't create room for the lungs to grow, which develop in the last few months of pregnancy. She was given a 50% chance of survival. A tragic, hopeless, negative photo to begin their story with their new baby girl. And in the midst of others telling them to terminate, they knew who their God was. And they trusted God with all their hearts. They chose to live life God's way. They went all in as they sought different support groups and eventually found this connection to a doctor in Florida who said if they had gone anywhere else, she probably would not have made it. So they ended up moving to Florida, or first they sent Mindy off, unknown, unclear of what was happening, but trusting God. They paid an enormous cost, an enormous financial cost, relational cost, right? Their family was separated for a season. They have 2 older boys as well. But as Chris said, when you put your faith in God and you trust God and you put the risk to go and do what God is telling you to do, it's amazing. Chris and Mindy, they're not famous, wealthy, powerful people. They're not any more holier than you or me. They are faithful, ordinary people looking to follow God with all their hearts. And they got to see God at work in their lives and redeem this baby girl. If you see her running around, on the staff team we call her the miracle baby, because it's a miracle. Now I recognize that some of you maybe are in the midst of a tragedy. You're like, I don't see the redemption. I don't see God's restoration yet. Or maybe you're like, I've been there, but now I'm on my third or my fourth tragedy. When will it end? Don't lose hope. Don't give up on God. Keep building that trust. You may not have clarity. You may not have the big picture. It might be a gloomy, small frame. But keep trusting God in the midst of your daily life. At the end of our service, when you guys are dismissed, I just want to invite, if you do feel like that's you and you're like, I am in the midst of my tragedy, there will be people up here who would love to pray with you and pray for you in the midst of what you're going through. So just keep that in mind at the end of service. As we come to a close and wrapping things up, I do want you to think about how God might be at work in the ordinary and mundane details of your ordinary life. The days today, joys and hardships, right? Because sometimes it can feel like, God, where are you? Are you even at work? Or sometimes you can't imagine that God would be trying to speak to you, and so you're not really even looking for where God is. But I don't want you to miss out on seeing God in small and ordinary details. And when I say small and ordinary details, I mean your morning cup of coffee. I mean a smile from somebody as you're pumping gas. I mean a slow traffic day. Taking out the trash, brushing your teeth, grocery shopping. Or maybe it is a moment of reconciliation. Someone has extended grace and forgiveness to you. Maybe it's a song. Maybe it's a child running around who is not supposed to be running around. That's something that was difficult for me. Like, I really wanted to see God in big, grandiose ways because I was like, that's you, Jesus. Okay, now I know because that was made very clear. And so I needed a discipline. I needed something to help me to see God in the ordinary moments. And so what helped me to start looking at that differently was a prayer practice called the Daily Examine. So if you flip your sermon notes over on the back, the Daily Examine, it's a prayer practice adopted from St. Ignatius of Loyola. He's a Catholic priest, a Jesuit. And it says, the Daily Examine is a prayer practice that reflects on the events of the day. It invites us to find the movement of God in all the people and events that took place. At the end of each day, the Examine serves as a way of increasing awareness of God's presence and movement toward us in very ordinary experiences. So this may not be something for everyone, but I want to give us a tool and give you an opportunity to start to become more aware of where God might be in your everyday life. As you wake up, as you get dressed, as you go about your day, as you come home, you put on your pajamas, you brush your teeth, and you go back to sleep. That's probably most of our days. Where is God in the midst of that? Well, God is there. God is there, and this practice can help us think about that and to see that. And I think it's important to do that so that way when we do notice God, when we do see something that happens, we can be like the women and give God the praise. Praise to the Lord, not praise to this random coincidence. Praise to the Lord. But if we don't know how God works and if we don't think that God is even working, then we're going to miss God altogether. So I'm just going to briefly go over this really quick just so that you have a sense of it. So it's a 5-step process. You would do it at the end of the day. I would do it sitting in my bed right before bed, and I had a journal right next to it and would go through these steps. The first thing is you just recognize God's loving presence, saying, God, thank you that you are here. Thank you that you are good and loving. And then you give God thanks and gratitude for the things in your life that you want to thank God for, being thankful and gracious. And then you take a moment and you look over your day and you think back and you want to find a moment of consolation, which means it's a time when you sensed God moving towards you, or maybe you sensed God's presence in your life. You sensed God's presence in a moment. A bird landing on the fence. That was one time I remember. I had that moment. That was my moment of consolation where I was like, ooh, I knew, God, that you were there. Just seeing that bird land so softly in that quiet. And you can take a moment to say, God, what were you trying to say to me in that moment? And then you look over your day and you ask God to reveal a moment of desolation, a moment where you were moving away from God or where you felt distant from God. And maybe that was a moment where you reacted in a way that was maybe not the best way towards something or someone. I don't know, maybe it was just a moment where you just didn't even think about God for the day. You didn't even think God was at work. And take that moment not to become overwhelmed by it, but just to be like, okay, I'm noticing that moment, experiencing God's grace in that. And then the next step is you will take that moment of desolation and you pray into that, whatever that might look like. Maybe you need to confess something to God, or you want to repent, or you want to lament something, or you want to ask for forgiveness, whatever that is, to give that desolation to God. And then the last step is to invite God into your day tomorrow. Being reminded that every day is a new day for you to get to experience and see God at work again. So even if maybe there was no consolation and only you experienced desolation, inviting God to be like, God, help me to see a moment of your presence tomorrow. And that's why that Lamentations verse is there. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness.